For nearly 4 centuries, the sun never set on the British Empire. At its peak in 1922, it ruled over 458 million people, nearly a quarter of the world's population, and controlled 13.7 million square miles of territory. From the frozen lands of Canada to the scorching deserts of Sudan, from the teeming streets of Calcutta to the windswept plains of Australia, the Union Jack flew over a global dominion unprecedented in human history. But how did a small island nation in the North Atlantic come to dominate the world? And why, within just a few decades, did the largest empire ever known crumble into history? This is the story of ambition and adventure, of conquest and commerce, of exploitation and resistance. This is the story of the British Empire. The Age of Discovery. Our story begins not with military conquest, but with a fishing expedition gone wrong. In 1497, John Cabot, an Italian navigator sailing under the English flag, set off from Bristol searching for a western route to Asia. Instead, he stumbled upon the cod-rich waters of Newfoundland. This accidental discovery would plant the first seeds of English overseas expansion. But England was late to the colonial game. While Spain and Portugal were already carving up the Americas with papal blessing, England remained a relatively minor power, preoccupied with religious turmoil and continental politics. Queen Elizabeth I, ascending the throne in 1558, would change everything. Elizabeth understood what her predecessors had missed: sea power was the key to wealth and influence. She quietly encouraged privateers, essentially state-sanctioned pirates, to raid Spanish treasure fleets returning from the New World. Sir Francis Drake, the most audacious of these sea dogs, circumnavigated the globe between 1577 and 1580, plundering Spanish settlements along the way and returning with enough treasure to pay off England's entire national debt. The first colonies. The English attempt at permanent colonization began with spectacular failure. Sir Walter Raleigh's colony at Roanoke, established in 1585 on the coast of present-day North Carolina, vanished without a trace, the infamous Lost Colony. But the English persisted. In 1607, the Virginia Company established Jamestown, England's first permanent settlement in North America. The early years were brutal. Of the original 104 colonists, only 38 survived the first year. Starvation was so severe that archaeological evidence suggests some resorted to cannibalism. Yet Jamestown survived, thanks largely to the cultivation of tobacco, a crop that would fuel Virginia's growth and entrench the institution of slavery in English America. To the north, religious dissenters sought a different kind of colony. The Pilgrims, landing at Plymouth Rock in 1620, and the Puritans, establishing Massachusetts Bay in 1630, came not for gold but for the freedom to worship as they pleased. These colonies would develop a character distinct from the plantation economies of the South, more democratic, more literate, and more economically diverse. The East India Company. While English adventurers were struggling in North America, a group of London merchants were launching what would become the most powerful corporation in history. Chartered by Elizabeth I on December 31, 1600, the East India Company received a monopoly on English trade with Asia. The company's early years were precarious. They operated from fortified trading posts, or factories, purchasing spices, silk, and cotton textiles from local merchants. The Mughal Empire, which controlled most of India, was at its zenith, vastly wealthier and more powerful than England. The English were tolerated as minor trading partners, nothing more. But the company was patient, and it was learning. It built its own private army, ostensibly to protect its warehouses. It cultivated relationships with local rulers. It played Indian kingdoms against each other. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a trading company was laying the groundwork for territorial conquest. The Caribbean and the slave trade. The English also cast their eyes toward the Caribbean, that string of tropical islands where sugar grew abundantly. Barbados, claimed in 1625, became England's first sugar colony. Jamaica, captured from Spain in 1655, would become even more valuable. Sugar cultivation was brutally labor-intensive, and the English turned to Africa to solve their labor shortage. English ships joined the triangular trade, manufactured goods to Africa, enslaved Africans to the Americas, sugar and tobacco back to England. Between 1640 and 1807, British ships transported approximately 3.1 million enslaved Africans across the Middle Passage, more than any other nation except Portugal. The wealth generated by sugar was staggering. By 1700, tiny Barbados generated more trade than all the North American colonies combined. Bristol, Liverpool, and Glasgow grew rich on the slave trade. The profits helped finance the Industrial Revolution. The human cost was incalculable. The First Empire, 1707 to 1783. Union and War. In 1707, England and Scotland united under the Act of Union, creating Great Britain. The new kingdom immediately plunged into a series of wars with France that would determine which nation would dominate the colonial world. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, was truly the first global conflict, fought on 3 continents. In North America, where it was known as the French and Indian War, British forces under General James Wolfe captured Quebec in 1759, effectively ending French power in North America. In India, the Company's army, led by Robert Clive, defeated the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 confirmed Britain's triumph. France ceded Canada and all its territory east of the Mississippi to Britain, and effectively withdrew from competition in India. Britain now possessed the most extensive empire the world had yet seen. But the costs of victory were enormous. Britain's national debt had doubled. Someone had to pay for all those soldiers and ships. Parliament decided the American colonists should contribute. The loss of America. The taxes seemed reasonable to Parliament: stamp duties, tea taxes, modest tariffs. But the colonists saw things differently. They had grown used to governing themselves, and they bristled at the idea of taxation without representation in Parliament. What began as protests escalated into rebellion. In 1775, colonial militia exchanged fire with British regulars at Lexington and Concord. A year later, the Continental Congress declared independence. Britain initially dismissed the rebellion as a minor insurrection, but France's entry into the war on the American side changed everything. In 1781, General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. 2 years later, Britain formally recognized American independence. The loss was devastating, not just territorially, but psychologically. How could the world's greatest power lose to a ragtag collection of colonial rebels? Yet even in defeat, the seeds of the Second Empire were already sprouting. While attention focused on America, Captain James Cook was mapping the Pacific, claiming Australia for the crown in 1770. And in India, the East India Company was transitioning from trader to ruler. India, from trade to dominion. The East India Company emerged from the 7 Years' War as the de facto ruler of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, regions containing perhaps 30 million people. This was empire by corporation, a bizarre hybrid of commercial enterprise and territorial administration. The company's rule was rapacious. The Bengal famine of 1770 killed an estimated 10 million people, or 1/3 of Bengal's population, partly due to company policies that prioritized revenue extraction over famine relief. Yet the wealth flowing back to Britain was enormous. Company officials returned home as nabobs, flaunting their Indian fortunes and buying country estates. The company steadily expanded its control through a combination of military conquest and political manipulation. The Maratha Wars, the Anglo-Mysore Wars, the Anglo-Sikh Wars, slowly, relentlessly, the company subjugated the subcontinent. By 1850, the East India Company ruled virtually all of India either directly or through puppet princes. Abolition and legitimate commerce. Back in Britain, voices were rising against the slave trade. Evangelical Christians like William Wilberforce, Quakers, and freed slaves like Olaudah Equiano campaigned tirelessly against the traffic in human beings. They argued that slavery was not just economically inefficient but morally abhorrent. In 1807, Parliament abolished the slave trade throughout the British Empire. In 1833, it abolished slavery itself, compensating slave owners, but not the enslaved, to the tune of £20 million, 40% of the government budget. Former slaves in British colonies were required to work as apprentices for several more years, a system barely distinguishable from slavery itself. Britain now positioned itself as the global opponent of slavery, using the Royal Navy to suppress the slave trade along the African coast. This humanitarian mission became justification for deeper involvement in Africa. British merchants promoted legitimate commerce, palm oil, timber, groundnuts, as an alternative to slave trading. Trading posts became protectorates. Protectorates became colonies. The scramble begins. Australia, initially established as a penal colony in 1788, grew as free settlers arrived seeking land and opportunity. The indigenous Aboriginal peoples, who had inhabited the continent for at least 65,000 years, were displaced, killed by disease and violence, and dispossessed of their lands under the legal fiction of terra nullius, empty land. In New Zealand, British settlement led to the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, which theoretically protected Maori land rights while establishing British sovereignty. In practice, the treaty was systematically violated, leading to decades of conflict. Canada, meanwhile, was being knitted together from disparate colonies. The Union of Upper and Lower Canada in 1841, followed by Confederation in 1867, created a vast dominion stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Southern Africa presented a different challenge. The Cape Colony, seized from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars, contained both British settlers and Dutch-speaking Boers. When Britain abolished slavery in 1833, thousands of Boers trekked into the interior, establishing independent republics and violently displacing African peoples. Britain would spend decades trying to assert control over the region. The Indian Rebellion of 1857. In May 1857, sepoys, Indian soldiers in the company's army, mutinied at Meerut. The immediate cause was a rumor that new rifle cartridges were greased with pig and cow fat, offensive to both Muslims and Hindus. But the underlying causes ran deeper: resentment of aggressive British annexations, cultural insensitivity, and economic exploitation. The rebellion spread rapidly across northern India. At Kanpur, rebels massacred British soldiers and civilians. The British response was equally brutal. Rebels were executed by being blown from cannons, entire villages were destroyed in reprisal. By 1858, the rebellion was crushed, but the East India Company was finished. The British government assumed direct control of India, making it the jewel in the imperial crown. Queen Victoria would later assume the title Empress of India, binding the subcontinent directly to the monarchy.